So the whole thing together is... Then he goes down that first arpeggio again. So after he goes chromatically here, he goes back down the 11th fret of the B string to the 12th fret of the G string to the 13th fret of the D string and pulls off to the 10th fret of the D string. So the whole thing... And this is where he does a cool little chicken picking thing. I'm not sure if he picks those notes or uses his middle finger. I like using the middle finger because I'm rude. I'm just kidding. So after he goes back to the 11th fret on the G string. Then he plays the 14th fret on the D string, or on the A string, I'm sorry. So he skips the D string. So you have... Then he goes down to the 10th fret on the G string. So that pattern is the 11th fret, you go on the G string, to the 13th fret on the D string, then the 10th fret on the G string. So that whole thing is... And here he does that again. He's repeating patterns a lot. He goes to the... After he pivots back to this, he goes to the 14th fret, pulls off to the 10th fret, goes back to the 11th fret, to the 12th fret, all on the D string. So you're seeing these reoccurring patterns. This whole thing of pulling off and chromatically going up, and this pattern. So, and then of course the arpeggio pattern. One note per string, down 3 strings, and then pull off. And then here, same thing, down 1 note per string, and then pull off to a note on that last string. So that whole thing is... And after he does that chromatic walk up again, he goes down that second arpeggio again, which is the 10th fret of the G string to the 12th fret of the D string, 13th fret of the A string, and pull off to the 10th fret of the A string. So that whole thing is... Then he slides down from the 10th fret to the 8th fret on the A string. Then he does this kind of octave pivot from that 10th fret of the... the 8th fret of the A string to the 10th fret of the G string. So he's skipping a string there. And then he goes back down to that 8th fret again. So... And then he pulls off from the 8th fret, hammers on from the 8th fret to the 10th fret of the G string. So... And then then he pulls off from the 10th fret to the 8th fret to the 6th fret on the G string. So that whole thing is... And then he goes down from that 6th fret of the G string, he goes to the 8th fret of the D string and the A string. So it's like a minor arpeggio. And then he slides down to the 6th fret on that A string. So that whole thing is... And when he gets to that note, he does one of his... this is another thing that is very... Tom does a lot of that where he's trilling two notes. Instead of that, he does a slide. So when he lands on that note, he slides up from that 6th fret to the 7th fret, back to the 6th fret on the A string. So that's... And then he plays the 8th fret on the D string. So that whole thing is... Then he goes down to back to the 6th fret of the A string, goes down to the 5th fret of the A string. So it's... Then he pivots off from that 5th fret of the A string to the 8th fret, back to the 5th fret. So that whole thing is... Now he's starting to walk up like a major 7 arpeggio. So the 5th fret of the A string to the 6th fret of the A string to the 5th fret of the D string to the 8th fret of the D string. So that's like your your E flat major 7 arpeggio starting on the major 7. There's your E flat major, root 3rd and 5th, and there's your major 7. So that whole thing is... And then he goes to... After he gets on the 5th of that major 7 arpeggio, he goes back down to the 5th fret. Then he walks up chromatically on, that's all on the D string. So 5, 6, 7. Then he plays the 5th fret on the G string. So 5, 6, 7 on the D string to the 5th fret on the G string. So that whole thing is... After he gets that note, he goes back down to the 7th fret of the D string, goes up to the 8th fret of the D string, and goes up to the 7th fret of the G string to the 6th fret of the B string. And again, that could be thought of as a major 7 arpeggio. So here's your major arpeggio, which is your B flat again, so root 3rd and 5th, and then here's your major 7 note. So far you have... And then he goes up to that, actually from the 6th fret, he goes up to the 8th fret of the B string, and then he goes down... It goes down what would look like maybe like a D major chord. Your just standard D major chord. So it's the 7th fret on the B string, 7th fret on the G string, and 7th fret on the D string. So let's go through that one time slow. Then after he goes down that, he moves down a whole step and he does that same pattern but with a little different rhythm. Instead of... He goes... So that's 5th fret B string, 5th fret G string, 5th fret D string, and then he slides down a half step to the 6th fret of the D string. And we'll get into this in a second, but that'll work great over like a D7 chord. Because you land on that major 3rd, and you play that 11th there. Anyway, so that whole thing is... this is where now he changes. Again, it's a similar pattern, but he goes from the 3rd fret of the B string, skips down to the 3rd fret of the D string, then he plays the 2nd fret of the G string to the 5th fret of the G string and 5th fret of the B string. So that's... So those patterns were pretty much the 7th fret to the 5th fret to the 3rd fret, but here instead of, he's playing that 2nd fret. So anyway, we'll get into some of what all is going on there and how you can actually use this in your own playing. But the general concept of what's going on, it's a lot of repetitive patterns with chromatic passing tones and arpeggios. And arpeggios are a great way to improvise over chord changes, especially if they're going by pretty quickly, because instead of trying to figure out scales and certain scale tones that work over certain chords and they don't over other chords, or they don't, a root 3rd and 5th works over a major chord, or a minor chord you play a minor arpeggio, so a root minor 3rd 5th. And if you stick to that principle, going over changes, and then maybe throw a 9th in every once in a while, or over an altered chord, throw in a flat 9 or something, and then you'll get that out tonality. But you don't have to do a lot of thinking. As long as you know your arpeggio shapes, you'll be pretty safe to kind of fly through changes. So anyway, let's get into some of the discussion, and we'll try and do this quickly, of what's really going on here.